Africa FM listeners, we're here at the second day of the conference on colonial crimes in Africa. The second day is still unfolding and buzzing with many conferences, many meetings among stakeholders to discuss how to make this crimes take accountability for what the harm they cause to African and African descent. And I am pleased to have with me here on the side of the session Dr. Kimani Nihusi, who just finished a panel talking deeply about the legalization framework of this, and we will dive into more details with him. First of all, thank you to accept this invitation, and we're happy to have you with us here.
Thanks for extending the invitation. Greetings to all our onlookers and listeners, your audience.
Thank you. Dr. Nihusi, the fourth session examines how colonial powers deliberately targeted Africa's cultural heritage. In your view, why was the cultural spoliation such a central tool of domination, and how does it continue to shape African identity until this very day?
Well, cultural identity is central to people's existence. And that's what tells you who you are, where you're coming from, what your purpose is. So anybody who attacks your cultural identity attacks something fundamental to your existence. And if your cultural identity is impaired or erased substantially or not, or fully, then you really are a non-person. You're exactly what the oppressors wanted. A human body without their own mind, so that they will do the bidding of those who oppress us. So really, you cannot offer any resistance to oppression. So somebody whose cultural identity has been erased or misshapen is somebody who is either doesn't know themselves or is severely unsure of themselves. And if you don't know who you are, or you're unsure about who you are, you cannot know or know for certain what your interests are. If you don't know what your interests are, you cannot defend them, you cannot promote them. And if you cannot promote or defend your interests, you are at the mercy of any breeze that blows in your face.
Indeed, that is indeed true. And when we talk about this, we often hear about the psychological side that deeply takes shape into this. And we often also see how, let's say, the dimensions of the psychological side takes effect of the historical trauma as well. So how has the long-term suppression of African identity, languages, philosophies and narratives affected the continent's self-perception across generations?
I want to start with Frantz Fanon, who is gloriously associated with the revolution in this country, Algeria, and who you have on the poster there. He was one of the first people who began the serious study of the identity and trauma. And without belaboring the point too much, because there's a lot to talk about there, trauma is inherited and passed on from generation to generation. And to merely outline the effects of the trauma upon African people today is to take up much space. But let me just say this. Diseases like heart disease, like diabetes, and a number of others were the direct result of enslavement and the traumas of enslavement. And they still affect millions of African people today, especially in the diaspora. In terms of culture and its immediate impact and continuing impact, let us just recognize that there are millions of African people on the continent and elsewhere who spend billions of dollars trying to get themselves lighter in complexion. They bleach. Now, many of those people expose themselves to serious harm. But the reason for them doing that is primarily because they've been so affected by colonialism that they have taken the colonial lesson, if I might call it that, and they actually believe that the way in which they were formed by the Creator is not good enough or not good at all. They want to try to become the people who oppress them. Now that is one of the clearest descriptions of the deepest disorder that's continuing to be transmitted from generation to generation among people in Africa and its communities abroad. So that's another way of the continuing effects of colonial crimes. But we could also speak about the economic condition of African people. I would say that Africa is poor because Europe, Western European colonials are rich, because they got rich by transferring the wealth of Africa to themselves.
Exploitation.
The exploitation. And I think that one current example demonstrates it very well, France. As soon as Mali and Niger, Guinea and other countries traditionally or historically exploited by France said no more, France has fallen into all kinds of economic difficulties. And I think it dramatizes the relationship between Europe, Western Europe, and Western European colonies, and pinpoints one of the most important processes that unfolded. And I think also one of the most important lessons that we must learn. African people must own all our resources, and the key resource is the African mind.
Indeed, indeed. Now, if we have to dive into something else and we talk about restitutions, much of the restitution debate focuses on restoring stolen objects. From your perspective, what deeper forms of restitution are required to repair the cultural and spiritual harm caused by the theft and destruction of, let's say, African heritage? And we could see many African heritage and artifacts has been stolen by colonies, by different nations, including some from the Pharaoh's era, from the pyramids, including artifacts from Ghana, from different nations, but these are the ones that has been returned only this year.
Well, artifacts like the monuments that are still in place in Egypt and other places, perhaps only because they're too heavy to be looted, those are physical manifestations, witnesses to something far greater than themselves. And that's something that's far greater is the spiritual culture of Africa. It's the way in which African people understood our relationship to the environment, to each other, to our past. Let me just go a bit deep and say that Africans were the first environmentalists in the world. Children lived this. You did not take more from the environment than was needed. The thing that regulated the relationship between African people and the environment was need, not greed.
Indeed.
Other people came to this continent and started to murder animals, to shoot them for sport. Today, when we talk about environmentalism and you see images of Africa with environmentalism today, you see white people. There's no African unless that African is something in the background playing some minor role or no role at all. Now I'm saying that we need to reverse this, and we reverse it by recovering our spiritual heritage and our social heritage and making certain that we become who we were before.
Another aspect that we need to discuss, and that is the Western institutions, as they frequently resist returning looted artifacts or impose strict conditions to returning it. But what strategies should African nations, let's say, adopt collectively, whether diplomatic, legal, or even cultural, to shift the power dynamic and accelerate genuine restitution for these artifacts?
Well, first, we need to understand why Western nations behave as they do. And the big word there is greed. They came here, they raped, they stole, and they carted off all kinds of material things to their own countries, thinking that they were beautifying themselves. The African response has got to be educating our own people and then the world about these steps and the meanings of these steps. I think we're at a critical juncture, and we need to make a strategic decision. Do we educate ourselves, or do we attempt to educate thieves and murderers in the Western Hemisphere? I think the answer is clear. Once we know who we are, and with the current trajectories of Africa, people retaking control of many natural resources, minerals and so on, I think it's critical for us to take control of the most important resource of all, the African mind. And once the African mind has returned to Africa, to its own self, to knowing itself, it will begin to service its own interests. And it will make up its mind in an intelligent way or intelligent ways about how to go about this business of repairing the cells.
Indeed, and let's go back to the plenary session that has just ended. It did explore a potential AU mechanism for reparations, but what core principles must such mechanism be built upon to ensure it becomes a powerful constitutional framework rather than just a symbolic initiative in addressing historical injustices and preserving Africa's collective memory?
Well, I think I articulated one, self-knowledge. Unless African people know who we are, we will not know what our interests are. And the interest in reparations will be determined by knowing beings who understand their own interests in that. Now, for me, it's important not only that African people know our interests, what we need repaired, but why we need these things repaired. A gentleman in the just concluded session talked about soul and so on. And this is an engagement with what those objects represented. To Europeans, they're fantastic, rare, and objects like that that have purely material benefits. That's not the context, social and spiritual, from which they were looted. And part of African people taking back those objects means taking them back with the understanding of what they represented, the context they were serving. And I think that's a very powerful statement of culture and identity. I also believe that people in your honorable profession, journalists, have an important part to play in all of this through re-articulating to people in Africa as well as outside Africa these important discussions and decisions, explaining to the people, educating the world. Because there's one supreme advantage of African people. We're the ones who have been dishonored. We're the ones who've been lied to and lied about. We're the ones who've been misrepresented. Now we're beginning to represent ourselves. There's a lot of corrections to be done. The immoralities of the past cannot be undone. Europe has proven itself not only immoral in the way in which it attacked Africa and destroyed African people, but it's proving itself immoral by its reluctance to hand over the stolen articles that it greedily took possession of. Every day in the courts of Europe, there are decisions made under a particular law that's called tort. And it says that if you injure anybody, you must do two things. You must restore the person to where they would have been had you not injured them, and you must compensate them for the injury you have caused them, the pain and so on, and also for any loss of earnings or so on that you have caused by your action. Europe did pay compensation at the end, for example, of enslavement, but guess what? They compensated themselves. They didn't compensate their victims, and they're still kicking and screaming about doing the right thing. So this whole question of reparation exposes European governments, at least governments, as being hypocrites, immoral people, liars, and totally without morality. And unless we point this kind of thing out, unless African people understand the immorality of Europeans in all of this, and in other things too, I don't think we're going to be setting the record straight. I don't think we're going to be educating ourselves fully and properly on this question of reparations.
Indeed, it is a deep topic that should be discussed and must be discussed, especially among the youth. And by mentioning the youth, any last message that you would like to say to the young Africans that are watching our, let's say, our hope for a better future?
The young people are the future.
Yeah.
And we cannot escape that. And if we want to transform Africa, we have to transform ourselves, meaning also, especially the young people. That's why I said that education and socialization need to be looked at again, because we have dysfunctional systems of education and of socialization. It pleases me greatly to see and hear younger people on the African continent and abroad beginning to engage in discussions about identity, about history, about ancient Africa and how it relates to us at this point in time and in these spaces that we occupy today. When I see African people beginning to make that critical distinction between what we used to do a generation or two ago in our struggle and what we're beginning to do now, I think it's very, very important. I am pleased because we're turning a corner. We are no longer people who are angry and just angry. We're people who are more and more informed about our past and therefore about who we are. And once we know our past, once we know where we're coming from, we will know where we are. And once we know where we're coming from and where we are, it's easy to know where we need to go. So that kind of identity is a very powerful pointer to our future. And I welcome young people who are beginning to engage in this way.
Thank you, thank you. You heard it all from Dr. Nihusi. He said everything that needs to be said. And well, this is where we stop our interview for today. Catch you for more interviews later on. Keep tuning to your favorite channel, Radio Africa FM. This is Iman Noued. Tune in out.